The successful video game movie adaptation has been one of Hollywood's white whales for decades. The audience potential is all there, as gaming has blown up in popularity and barreled its way onto the mainstream like a tank. But, since Super Mario Bros. Disappointed fans and critics alike when it came to theaters in 1993, to 2016's Warcraft adaptation that critics panned as a CGI-riddled mess, video game movies have yet to hit a real stride. Rotten Tomatoes, a site which collects professional and audience reviews, average rating of 41 video game movies on their site comes out to a dismal 17% out of a possible 100%, with the lowest scoring being Alone in the Dark with a 1%, and the highest being Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within at 44%. And people have been asking, why is this? Though video games themselves have come a long way since the era of Pac-Man on all levels, especially in terms of story, transferring those experiences to screen has proved challenging. Part of this comes from the unique way video games tell stories. As Betty Kaklamanadu observes in her article Silent Hill Adapting a Video games are interactive, and, as such, have to be played in order to be appreciated. Adapting the feelings invoked by the natural interactivity video games have is but one hurdle of attempting video game movies, though, as across the films I surveyed for this research, the most common critique from reviewers was that they all contained weak storytelling, thin characters, and poor dialogue.
You're alive! Too bad you will die.
This can often be credited to video game writing itself, as many video games only contain a story to justify the gameplay. Despite this, Ostenson points out that video games themselves are an incredibly powerful medium for telling real narratives in unique ways. Ostenson states that video games represent some of the most important storytelling in the 21st century. This new medium represents our society's efforts to push the boundaries of storytelling in meaningful ways. Video game storytelling has taken dramatic strides in the past 20 years. No longer content with framework stories or the mostly storyless worlds of arcade games, developers and gamers alike wanted to see narratives told in ways that could only be done in the interactive medium of games. Take the story of The Last of Us, which in its first minutes has you looking through the eyes of a young girl living with her single father, instants before the world falls into the chaos of a zombie-esque outbreak, and you switch to the perspective of her desperate father trying to protect his child in a world thrown upside down. Then, minutes after that, watching that child die in your arms. But she didn't really die, and much less die in your arms. She was a fictional product of artists and animators and writers, dying in the arms of another digital character. It's just a game. But to the player, all that feels real, because the player has been controlling the actions of these characters, looking through their eyes, projecting themselves into the experiences of these characters. So if stories like that are available, why is it that video game movies have failed to garner critical and box office acclaim and, as producer Ari Arad states, not had their Iron Man moment? Video game narratives should be considered evolved enough at this point to allow for excellent screenplays to be based off them. Games like the aforementioned Last of Us are praised for its storytelling and emotionally impactful character relations. BioShock tells a complex story about the illusion of choice in a horrific dystopian setting, and Spec Ops: The Line gives a dramatic look at the effect of war-induced PTSD. With my research, I hope to shed some light on some of the core problems with video game movies, as well as some possible solutions for the future of the genre. To gather information for this presentation, I performed a textual analysis of 3 video game movies. Super Mario Bros., directed by Rocky Morton and Annabelle Jankel in 1993, Mortal Kombat, directed by Paul W.S. Anderson in 1995, and Warcraft, directed by Duncan Jones in 2016. Super Mario Bros. Was selected for being the first true attempt at a video game movie, and also one of its most infamous failures, due to the acclaim of its source material, the jarring differences to the game, as well as its incredibly troubled production. Mortal Kombat was selected because, while it did a much better job accurately portraying the game world it was based on, the game itself was not a good choice for adaptation due to the game's focus on gameplay and only had a story as a framework. Warcraft is one of the more recent video game movie adaptations, as well as having a much higher budget and holding the record for the most successful box office revenue. It had a very accurate depiction of the game universe it was based on and was well received by fans of the game, but not critics. I studied each of these films by watching them, as well as studying others' analysis of them, critical reviews from professionals and audiences, and interviews with cast and crew such as director Duncan Jones, as well as an interview with Iron Man producer Avi Arad. I also performed less in-depth studies of other video game movies in order to get a better feel for the genre as a whole. I also studied 3 scholarly articles retrieved from the JSTOR.org database, and 2 video presentations from YouTube by video game and film analyst Matthew Patrick and by the Extra Credits team. I also performed analysis of the YouTube channel Corridor Digital, who grew to popularity based on their short films inspired by and often parodying video games since 2010. The first attempt at a video game movie adaptation was 1993's Super Mario Bros. The film was based on the Super Mario Bros. Video game series, though it bears little resemblance to its source material. After Super Mario Bros., the 90s saw 7 more video game movies, including 2 Mortal Kombat films and 2 Pokemon movies. The 2000s saw 24 video game movies over the course of 10 years, at least 9 of which were directed by Uwe Boll between 2003 and 2008. We'll talk about him later. During this time, the Resident Evil series of movies based on the game series of the same name was launched. This series is the longest-running video game movie adaptation series, with 6 films released and a total box office gross of over $1 billion, in spite of poor critical reception. In the 2010s, 9 adaptations have been released, with 4 more slated to release between 2017 and 2019. Notably, 4 of these 9 films were released in 2016 alone, which is partially what sparked my interest in this subject, as I had high hopes for one of these films, Warcraft, to be the success story everyone had been waiting for. Unfortunately, it was not well received by critics, but it was enjoyed by fans of the Warcraft series for being true to the lore and setting. Warcraft was a success story in some senses, setting the record for the highest-grossing video game movie of all time at $433 million worldwide, in large part due to international audiences and China, where it broke multiple box office records. However, video game movies still hold their reputation as bad cinema, and not without justification. Before moving on to some of the fundamental problems video game movies face, one person whose influence must be addressed is Uwe Boll, a German filmmaker, restaurateur, amateur boxer, and responsible for a wave of video game movie adaptations that set the standard expectation that video games are truly bad films. His film Alone in the Dark holds a 1% rating, and is considered to be one of the worst films of all time. His other films fare almost as badly, all being commercial and critical flops. Boll is incredibly belligerent towards critics, even challenging 5 of his harshest to boxing matches in an event dubbed Raging Boll, where he defeated each critic in the ring. He constantly lashes out at Hollywood, critics, and other directors in online rants. But under this is not a delusional filmmaker, but rather a financier with a clever mind for abusing tax code. In the 70s, with the rapid global rise of Hollywood, several European countries made incentives in hopes of promoting local filmmakers. Among these was a German law, which stated that any investments made into filmmaking were tax deductible. Companies began to take advantage of this, including at the time amateur filmmaker Boll. Boll created his own production company, Boll KG, in order to finance his films. He then proceeded to purchase the film licensing rights to multiple video games and started filming. The tax law meant Boll could move large sums of money around his production budgets without paying any taxes, and soon Boll KG became a tax shelter for German investors. These video game adaptations were purposefully bad, as the law indicated that taxes only had to be paid on any returns the film made back. So a film failing financially meant even less taxes had to be paid. Eventually, the law was removed, and Boll faded away from video game movies until his retirement in 2016. The effect Boll had on the public perception of video game movies is undeniable. His films were violent, insensitive, poorly made, and often only extremely loosely based on the video games they represented. Matthew Patrick states in his video on game movies that one reason it seems like there aren't any good game movies is because no one tried, in reference to Boll. Not all video game movies have the excuse of being part of a tax fraud scheme to defend themselves. The most common complaint by reviewers about video game movies is the writing, stories, and dialogue. This is in part due to the writing in video games themselves often taking a back seat in the development process. As video games are an interactive medium, they rarely start out as a story someone wants to tell, but instead start with a game mechanic, new hardware or game engine, or in some cases at the command of a publisher. This means that writing takes a back seat. This is most evident in arcade games like Super Mario Bros., Save the Princess from the Monster, Street Fighter, Win the Tournament, Double Dragon, Save the Girlfriend from the Mobster, Doom, Demons, Now in Space, where the story serves only as an explanation for the gameplay. Doom's most recent title in 2016 made its stance on story quite clear from the beginning.
But it was worth the risk, I assure you.
Which was considered a welcome return to form after the previous games traded action and speed for an attempt at a more complex narrative. Even games with seemingly more complex stories like Mortal Kombat are usually just creating a setting. Mortal Kombat technically tells the story of a multi-world fighting tournament with the fate of the Earth involving a peace treaty with a hellish world on the line. But that is just used to explain why a four-armed barbarian and a ninja with a lizard head are fighting on top of a Buddhist temple. Yet, all of these games were made into movies. The Mortal Kombat movie is loved by some for its accurate adaptation of the game world it's based on, but the choice to make Mortal Kombat into a film at all was based on the game's arcade infamy and popularity, not because of its story potential. So with none of the gameplay that made the games famous and entertaining gone, all that remains is the framework story. Even modern video games suffer from this, and unless a studio specifically focuses on story-heavy video games like BioWare's Mass Effect and Dragon Age series, or Naughty Dog's Uncharted franchise, it is very rare for them to have an in-house writing team. Most instead hire freelance writers late in the development cycle. This places extraneous restrictions on the writer, as they now have to write within the confines of the game's mechanics, aesthetics, tone, and systems. Many of these freelance writers are also writing in an unfamiliar medium: interactive media. Games that have a story usually tell it in an open-ended way, allowing the player to make choices that affect the plot and other interactions. So, writers do what they can, and the game will be judged off its gameplay far more than its story. But when that game is then translated to film, and the story comes to the forefront without any assistance from the gameplay, the bad writing starts to show. If no effort is made to tell a better story or properly translate the experience of the game over to film, the piece suffers greatly. This idea is discussed in Betty Calcamondo's Silent Hill, adapting a video game. As the film made several changes, like using a female protagonist to emphasize a mother-daughter story, and pulled elements from the first two Silent Hill games rather than just attempting to translate one game. Worryingly, it seems that some studios actually dumbed down some game stories for film, such as in the case of Warcraft. Director Duncan Jones, a fan of the Warcraft games, said that the first thing he had to do was fix the script when he was brought onto the project. He stated, "Their approach earlier had been a little more traditional in my mind. It had been that the humans were the good guys, and the creatures were the bad guys. And my sort of spin on it, which I think was much more in keeping with the games, was that the bad guys, or the creatures rather, had heroes on their side too. So good guys and bad guys was more a matter of characters which made bad choices, as opposed to the monsters being bad, humans being good." The film is actually well received by fans of the series like myself because he was much truer to the source material than many video game movies are. The Warcraft series of games have a wealth of lore and narrative content with deeply embedded themes of the gray areas of war that always gives the players a view of both sides of the conflict. Had the film abandoned these themes, it would have been a far throw from the source material. Creative liberties should be taken to improve a story, but these decisions should never compromise the heart of the narrative. Focusing on an accurate portrayal of the game over optimizing the story for film does come at a cost, such as the case of Warcraft, in which film audiences and film critics felt the movie spent a lot of time on exposition, attempting to explain to them an unfamiliar world. This opens up an important conflict. Should the film target video game fans, or should it appeal to a movie-going audience? Most video game movies tend to focus on the latter, with studios hoping to appeal to their standard audience. This, based on my research and my opinion as a gamer, is a terrible mistake. By their very nature, a video game movie is already too video game for a movie audience. This is evident again in the disparity between the professional critics and audience reviews of the Warcraft film. Film critics disliked the overuse of CGI to depict non-human characters and effects, as well as the overabundance of exposition and fantastical words, names, and places. But the gamer audience, who was familiar with the places and characters, praised the accurate depictions of the story. This unfamiliarity with the game is not only evident in the reception of these films, but also permeates the filmmaking crew working on these movies. Director Duncan Jones stated that, "I think a lot of people who are kind of brought into these movie projects who don't really know about the game try too hard to bring in what they think the game is, and maybe sometimes miss the experience that the players of the games are craving to see in a movie. That experience is what is key to game movie adaptations. The experience that someone gets from playing the game." Betty Kalkamoto points out in Silent Hill adapting a video game that since places, characters, and storylines can be transported from video games to film very easily, the study of video game film adaptations should be on the decisions the filmmaking team makes during the ingredient selection process. This ingredient selection process refers to the aspects of the game that are translated to film. One of the most underused ingredients, in an attempt to tone down the video game aspect of a film, is the actual mechanics from the games that are translated. One such mechanic that exists in almost every game, but rarely if ever appears in video game movies, is player death. Failure is a part of games. Modern games often make death or failure visually impactful, one of the best to do so being Tomb Raider's 2013 remake. The game featured many QuickTime events, cinematic scenes where the player must react to button prompts in order to make timed actions, in which the player character Lara Croft is in peril. Failing these button prompts would result in Croft dying, often in brutal fashion. These death scenes' absence was felt a decade ago in the first Tomb Raider film, as stated by Will Brooker. Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, ignores the opportunity to recreate the player's experience of having Lara seen to die, even if only on one occasion, and then be able to restart a sequence, game-style, for another attempt. The irony in this situation is that there are two highly successful films that use this mechanic as the core of the story: Edge of Tomorrow and Groundhog Day. Each film has the lead character dying and returning to a set point in time with all knowledge of what they did before they died. This perfectly emulates the reload or checkpoint mechanics in many video games, where if a player dies or fails in some other way, they return to a set point in the game beforehand. Their death is not meaningless. It usually has consequences like losing points, time, or number of attempts before you must restart entirely. All of these are incredibly familiar to gamers. Edge of Tomorrow in particular was called the best video game movie not actually based on a video game. If a movie can be built out of a single game mechanic, imagine a video game movie accurately transferring the feeling of all its mechanics to screen. One place that translating video game mechanics and intricacies has had no problem is online in places like YouTube. Here, inspired gamers and filmmakers have been creating video game adaptations for years. This is expertly displayed in the Rocket Jump short Hitman, which in less than 5 minutes manages to more truthfully embody the Hitman game series than either of the Hollywood Hitman films. The short perfectly captures the main aspects of the game as well as paying tribute to its quirks, such as how Agent 47 is shown acting exactly as he does in the game, right down to how he relentlessly stares down his target once they are in sight and uses that to make a humorous moment. Aside from the mechanics, the way the game is played is also passed properly to film. The Hitman game series seems like prime material for a movie. The main character is a cloned assassin, designed to be the perfect killing machine, who carries out his jobs with brutal efficiency for an evil organization that raised and eventually betrays him. This is what Hitman Agent 47 in 2015 embodied: an action-heavy thriller with flashy gunfights and intrigue. But the film failed to resonate with critics or gamers. This was because the actual Hitman series of games are not about thrill or intrigue. They're about finding and dispatching targets in creative, efficient, and often darkly humorous ways. The experience of a Hitman game is far more tied to its gameplay than its story or setting, which means adapting the experience of playing the game is the most important part. As Avi Arad stated in an interview with Polygon, a good video game movie is sort of like a good sports movie. I don't watch sports, but I really like sports movies and sports writing. I love that because it allowed me to feel about the sport the way a person who created the movie or writing felt. That's the brass ring for adapting a video game into a movie. At the conclusion of his game theory episode on the flaws of video game movies, Matthew Patrick states that when you adapt a novel or comic book to film, you generally add something to it by adding visuals and movement previously only imagined. But when a video game is translated, you instead remove an element, since video games possess everything movies do and more in the form of inherent interactivity. He makes the argument that movies are a step back in terms of storytelling, and we should not be bothering to make adaptations, and instead of making video games into better movies, we should focus on making good movies into awesome video games. Through the use of new film techniques and hardware like virtual reality and 360-degree cameras to create more immersive films. While I agree with Patrick on many things, the idea that films have nothing to offer video games is one I fully disagree with. While video games do offer an incredible narrative medium unlike anything before it, films can give beautiful, artistic renditions of emotion, vision, and character that the freedom of video games often overwhelms. Most games need to employ ways to force the players to stop doing their own thing for a moment in order to tell their story. Like cutscenes, which take control from the player in order to show a scene, film allows a specific vision to be told, and properly done video game movies could tell stories that players may have missed, or introduce non-gamers to a story they would otherwise never see. I would like to finish this by speaking on the potential of video game movie adaptations that step outside the realm of traditional feature films. Take Dark Souls, for instance. Dark Souls, in an elevator pitch, is a fantasy game set in a dark, foreboding world where anything and everything can and wants to murder you. Well, where a Hollywood executive might see the potential for a gritty fantasy action film, I see the beginnings of a short, quiet film about struggle. The Dark Souls game series may indeed be about combating your way through macabre monsters, but is also seeped in melancholy, where you are placed in the boots of a lost soul struggling to reclaim their humanity in a dying world. This is a game whose tagline is "Prepare to Die." It is a game which tells its story through the ruined castle in the distance, the broken body slumped in a corner, the inscriptions on a ring. This is not a game about action, but rather one of contemplation. Even the action and combat is about contemplation. The game viciously punishes players making mistakes, and patience, learning the attack patterns of opponents, when to dodge, when to strike, is the watchword of the series. The combat is slow and meticulous, where the weight of weapons and armor seem to drag on the player character and monsters. Were Dark Souls to be made into a film, I would recommend a director with the talent for suspense and atmosphere. Someone who can carry a film without its directors even uttering a word. This encapsulates the Dark Souls experience. A toiling struggle against encroaching death, like Sisyphus pushing the boulder. Many gamers have wanted to see stories in Valve's Half-Life and Portal games, and Valve has stated an interest in doing these films themselves without outside producers getting in the way. This is understandable, especially with Portal, as the game is about solving puzzles. While the writing in the game is spectacular, taking the form mostly of the taunting voices of the game's antagonist GLaDOS, it is best heard in the context of the game, alongside the brain-bending puzzles the player faces.
So sometimes there's still trash in them, standing around, smelling and being useless. Try to avoid the garbage hurtling towards you. Remember before when I was talking about smelly garbage standing around being useless? That was a metaphor. I was actually talking about you. And I'm sorry. You didn't react at the time, so I was worried it sailed right over your head, which would have made this apology seem insane. That's why I had to call you garbage a second time just now.
This is why I believe a Portal film would be an excellent place to tell a thriller set before the events of the game. The world of Portal is well fleshed out, and the story of what happened in the science testing facility it takes place in is told through hints and clues, rather than experiencing it for yourself. Many of these clues are left by the character Doug Ratman, a scientist who worked at the facility. It is revealed that he was the one responsible for setting the character you play as, Chell, free from stasis in order to defeat GLaDOS. This is expanded in a comic called Lab Rat, which was written to promote the game Portal 2. It follows the schizophrenic scientist Ratman as he survives in the decrepit facility, flashing in and out of memories of how the artificial intelligence GLaDOS took over the lab and killed everyone but Ratman who escaped. This comic is the perfect example of telling a video game story that would otherwise be missed, and would make for an intriguing film that follows a non-linear story. Good direction, coupled with the same writers who created the gallows humor dialogue for the games, would make the film that anyone, gamer or not, would enjoy. The final option is simply to wait. Video game movies are seen by some to be in the same place that comic book movies were a few years ago, long considered unwatchable and risky to make. This was until 2008, with the release of Iron Man. Iron Man was considered an unpopular comic book character who has now risen to be one of the most famous and recognized due to his films. Ari Arad, who co-produced the film, spoke on how they pulled the heart of the character rather than one specific depiction onto the screen in order to make the movie. Another aspect is that by 2008, the active directors in Hollywood were people who had grown up reading comic books. Now, comic book movies rule the box office. The same may someday happen to video game movies, as filmmakers like Sam Gorski and Nico Puringer of the YouTube channel Corridor Digital, who are both active gamers who made their names spoofing and adapting video game movies with short films, move up the ranks in Hollywood and start making video game movies on the big screen. That time may be coming sooner than expected though, as Arad is co-producing 3 video game movies and is a gamer himself, as well as Duncan Jones' direction of Warcraft, as he was a Warcraft fan for 20 years. In the end, I truly believe that good video game movies can be achieved. And when it happens, I'll be there in the theater with my popcorn.